He was born on a small island, far from the center of power. His family had noble blood, but not the wealth people imagined. Corsica had just fallen under French control, and identity already felt complicated. From the beginning, he did not fully belong anywhere. Even as a boy, his eyes carried something heavy, ambition mixed with resentment. Then he was sent away from home, across the sea to France. At military school, he entered a world that saw him as foreign. Other boys mocked his accent, his manners, and where he came from. So instead of becoming popular, he disappeared into books. History, mathematics, and artillery became the language he trusted most. Artillery was not glamorous, but it rewarded precision, patience, and calculation. He was small, serious, quiet, always watching how power moved. Meanwhile, France itself was beginning to break apart. The old monarchy cracked under hunger, anger, debt, and revolution. For most people, chaos meant danger. For a skilled outsider, it meant opportunity. At first, he had no great power, no legendary army, and no crown. But revolutionary France desperately needed men who could actually solve military problems. And at the artillery table, he began showing something rare: practical genius. France was unstable, violent, and uncertain, but it was also open. Then came the first major test of his career, the siege of Toulon. Toulon was a fortified port, and its harbor mattered more than almost anything. While others saw walls and ships, he saw the weak point. His plan was simple in theory, brutal in practice. Move the guns. Artillery changed the siege because it changed what the enemy could hold. Once the harbor became vulnerable, the entire position began to collapse. After Toulon, powerful officers finally noticed the young artillerymen. Promotion came quickly, not because he was loved, but because he was useful. The revolution rewarded talent when the old system no longer had enough answers. His fame did not begin with a throne. It began with reports, smoke, and mud. Toulon opened the first door, and he walked through it fast. Paris was frightened, unstable, and full of political danger. The government needed force, but also someone willing to use it. So the young officer was called into a crisis much larger than himself. Cannons were placed in the streets, not for glory, but for control. Smoke filled Paris, and order returned through fear. That day gave him a ruthless reputation, calm, decisive, and dangerous. After that, Paris began remembering his name. The outsider had become useful to the people who controlled the Republic. Soon, he received a new command, the Army of Italy. He left for Italy with ambition, uncertainty, and a chance to become more. The army he inherited was tired, poorly supplied, and low on confidence. Many soldiers looked at him and wondered if this young commander could lead them. His answer was speed. Move faster than the enemy could understand. Through mountains, mud, and exhaustion, he forced the army forward. He separated his enemies before they could combine their strength. Then came fast victories that shocked older, slower armies. The soldiers began to believe because results changed everything. Momentum built as roads, towns, bridges, and supplies fell into French hands. At Lodi, smoke and pressure turned a battlefield into a legend. After Lodi, he was no longer just a commander. He was becoming a symbol. Northern Italy began opening before him, one movement at a time. Victories became negotiations, and negotiations became political power. Dispatches raced back to Paris, carrying the story of a rising general. His reputation spread through newspapers, rumors, officials, and public imagination. Austria felt the pressure as its commanders struggled to predict his movements. At Arcole, mud, smoke, and confusion became another test of nerve. He took risks near the front, not because he was invincible, but because image mattered. Victory became a pattern, and the pattern became terrifying. He was becoming more than a battlefield commander. He was becoming a political force. To many in France, he now looked like the hero the revolution had been waiting for. His victories in Italy turned into treaties, borders, and influence. When he returned, he brought back something more valuable than treasure: power. His marriage also connected ambition, society, influence, and image. Printing presses helped build the legend faster than any battlefield could. But his ambition was no longer satisfied by Europe alone. So a fleet sailed toward Egypt, carrying soldiers, scholars, and dreams of empire. Across the Mediterranean, the expedition looked bold, distant, and dangerous. When French troops landed in Egypt, they entered a world they barely understood. The desert punished them with heat, distance, thirst, and exhaust. Then the pyramids appeared on the horizon, like history watching them arrive. The army won battles in Egypt, but victory there was never simple. Beside the soldiers came scholars, measuring, sketching, collecting, and studying. Then disaster struck at sea, and the French fleet was destroyed. Suddenly, the army was trapped far from France. Even failure had to be shaped into a story the public could accept. So the general left Egypt behind and sailed back toward opportunity. France was still unstable, tired, and desperate for order. His return felt perfectly timed, because fame often matters more than truth. Behind closed doors, political figures began plotting a new government. The coup began with soldiers, pressure, confusion, and calculated risk. Inside the assembly, power nearly slipped out of his hands. But in the end, paperwork, troops, and fear changed the government. He became first consul, ruler in everything but name. After years of revolution, France began rebuilding around administration and control. The law became one of his strongest tools. Officials, soldiers, courts, roads, and records turned chaos into a working state. Step by step, temporary power became permanent authority. Then the symbols of monarchy returned, but under a new man. At the coronation, he placed the crown on himself. Europe understood the message. The revolution had produced an emperor. The empire was now a machine of soldiers, clerks, roads, laws, and supplies. The Grande Armée assembled with frightening organization and confidence. Across Europe, French columns moved with discipline, speed, and pressure. At Austerlitz, he set a trap by making weakness look real. In the morning fog, the battlefield waited in silence. When the enemy moved, the center opened, exactly as planned. Austerlitz made him seem almost untouchable. After that, Europe was rearranged by victories, treaties, and fear. But power also created pressure: blockades, resistance, and economic strain. In Spain, occupation turned into a grinding war of anger and resistance. Then came the gamble that would begin breaking everything: Russia. A huge army crossed east, confident that size and speed would decide the war. But the road gave them distance, hunger, empty villages, and failing supplies. Moscow was reached, but it did not deliver victory. Then winter turned the campaign into a retreat. The army that had once terrified Europe was now fighting just to survive. Across the continent, enemies saw weakness for the first time in years. Coalitions closed in from every direction. At Leipzig, the scale of opposition became too great to overcome. Eventually, power ended the way it often begins, with paper, silence, and pressure. He was sent to Elba, reduced from emperor to ruler of a small island. But he returned once more, and for a moment, the old magic seemed alive. At Waterloo, mud, timing, and enemies ended the final gamble. His last exile was farther away, lonelier, and final. The poor island outsider had nearly conquered Europe, then became memory, myth, and warning.